There comes a point when a man doesn't chase anymore, not out of pride, but out of peace. Not because he stopped caring, but because he finally started listening to the quiet voice within, the one that says, "You don't have to prove your worth to be worthy." Sometimes she lets you go thinking you'll remain emotionally parked at the edge of her world, scrolling, remembering, hoping. But when you don't, when you let go too, not in bitterness, but in clarity, that's when everything shifts. That's when it hits her differently. And that is what this video is about. The quiet, grounded strength of a man who walks away, not to play games, but to guard his peace. Not to escape emotion, but to master it. The kind of transformation Stoic philosophy speaks to, a strength born not from force, but from stillness. Welcome to Stoic Station, where we don't just talk about letting go, we talk about rising. If you're ready to reclaim your power and walk a higher path, you're in the right place. Let's explore what really happens when you let go, and why that single decision changes everything. 1. She thought you'd linger, but you built momentum. She thought you'd hover, like most men do, hover just close enough to be felt, but not far enough to be gone. She believed you would remain quietly tethered, emotionally parked at the edge of her life, waiting for a sign, an opening, a reversal. Perhaps you wouldn't message her every day, but you'd still be there, watching her stories, liking a post, replying to the occasional, "Hey, hope you're doing well." In her mind, you were still orbiting, like a silent moon circling her world. Present, predictable, still hers in some invisible way. But that's not what happened. You didn't cling to the role she silently cast you in. You didn't remain suspended in limbo, hoping she'd come to her senses. Instead, you did something she didn't expect. You moved forward. Not with noise or drama, not with bitterness or some grand exit, but with quiet determination. You didn't just disappear, you accelerated, with purpose, with clarity, into yourself. You reconnected with passions you had placed on hold. You started running again, not just on the trail, but through the walls of doubt that had quietly formed while you were trying to hold something together that was already falling apart. You booked that solo trip you'd talked yourself out of for years. You surrounded yourself with the kind of people who didn't just see your worth, they reminded you of it when you forgot. You started showing up differently, not to prove anything to her, but to finally show up for yourself. She mistook your silence as waiting, but your silence was preparation. It was momentum building in the background. It was a man realigning with who he was before the confusion, before the compromise, before he forgot how to walk alone with power in his stride. You didn't choose stillness to keep the door ajar. You chose it to find your direction again. And maybe one day she'll scroll through an old message or hear your name in passing and wonder where you went. She'll assume you're still lingering somewhere, holding space in the same emotional waiting room. But by then you'll be long gone, not out of malice, but because you've outgrown the need to stay. That's the thing about momentum. It doesn't always start with movement. Sometimes it begins in silence, in a breath, in a decision made in the quiet of your own mind. I'm not going to wait anymore. And once that decision takes root, you stop orbiting someone else's life and start building the kind of life that doesn't wait for permission to be lived. She thought you'd linger, but you didn't. You evolved, and that changed everything. 2. You chose growth over guilt. You could have stayed there, trapped in the mental echo chamber where every conversation replays on loop, where every pause feels like a missed opportunity and every silence sounds like failure. You could have let your thoughts devour you, asking yourself again and again, what did I miss? What could I have done differently? Guilt has a way of creeping in like that, quiet at first, then louder until it becomes the only voice you hear. But you didn't let it own you. You made a different choice, a harder one. You chose growth. And in doing so, you refused to let your healing be held hostage by someone else's decisions. You recognized something few people ever fully understand, that the apology you may never receive, the explanation that may never come, is not what frees you. What frees you is the moment you decide your peace is no longer up for negotiation. There were nights when the weight of it almost pulled you back, the need to reach out, to ask for clarity, to get some kind of final word that might make sense of the hurt. But instead, you sat with the discomfort. You faced it. You poured your thoughts into pages of a journal not meant for anyone but you. You recorded voice memos that captured the truth you weren't ready to speak out loud yet. You didn't run from your pain. You walked alongside it until it softened. That was your release. That was your closure. It didn't come dressed in dramatic goodbyes or late-night confessions. It came quietly, in the way you started showing up for yourself again, in the way you stopped looking backward, in the way you slowly, patiently allowed yourself to become more than what was left behind. There's a certain kind of strength that comes from not needing someone to validate your healing, from no longer placing your emotional recovery in the hands of the very person who broke your peace. You chose to reclaim your power not by reacting, but by rising, not by needing answers, but by embracing the truth that some chapters close without explanation. And that doesn't make your story any less complete. The guilt didn't disappear overnight, but you stopped feeding it. You stopped letting it write your narrative. And with every small act of self-compassion, you grew stronger, steadier, clearer. You weren't chasing her forgiveness anymore. You were learning how to forgive yourself, for staying too long, for giving too much, for forgetting your own worth in the name of love. That's the quiet revolution of choosing growth over guilt. It doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It's subtle, it's slow. But one day you wake up, and there's more peace than pain, more acceptance than confusion. And you realize you didn't just survive the loss, you transformed through it. And that changes everything. 3. You didn't try to remind her what she lost. You didn't turn your healing into a performance. You didn't curate moments online for her to stumble across, hoping a photo or a quote might spark something in her. Regret, longing, anything. That's not the path you chose. You weren't interested in indirect messages, carefully crafted captions, or subtle attempts to make her wonder. You didn't weaponize your progress as a silent plea for recognition. Because deep down you knew, true growth isn't loud, and peace doesn't need to prove itself. Instead, you began living, not for her attention, but for your own alignment. You didn't move forward so she could look back and second-guess her choice. You moved forward because you were tired of standing still. You took back your mornings. You made small promises to yourself and kept them. You began choosing what nourished your soul, not what fed the illusion of being okay. There were moments, of course, quiet, tempting moments, where the thought crossed your mind. Maybe she'll see me now. Maybe she'll notice what she lost. But you let the thought pass, like a cloud drifting through a wider sky. You didn't cling to it, because the truth is, you weren't healing so she'd miss you. You were healing because you missed yourself, the man you were before the overthinking, before the self-doubt, before love made you forget how strong you truly are. In a world where everyone rushes to prove how well they're doing, you chose a quieter rebellion. You embodied your transformation with grace. You didn't need a witness. You became your own. And perhaps that's what makes your absence so unforgettable. Not because you forced her to remember you, but because you finally remembered yourself. And that kind of presence, the one that doesn't chase, doesn't beg, doesn't need to be seen to exist, that's the one that lingers long after you've walked away. 4. You gave space without bitterness. When it ended, you could have clung to the fragments. You could have negotiated a lesser role in her life, just friends, occasional check-ins, some version of staying close while slowly fading, but you didn't. You knew that pretending to be okay while quietly hoping for her return wasn't strength, it was self-betrayal. So you didn't stay in her orbit under the guise of friendship. You didn't mask your pain with sarcasm or drop passive-aggressive comments to signal how much you were hurting. You didn't try to make her feel your absence by lacing your silence with anger. Instead, you chose clarity. You gave her space, not to prove a point, not to guilt her into coming back, but because you respected her decision and respected yourself even more. You didn't weaponize the distance. You honored it. Not every goodbye needs to be loud, and not every ending requires conflict. You understood that true detachment isn't laced with resentment. It's wrapped in quiet dignity. There's a grace in letting go without needing to be seen as the bigger person. There's power in not needing to rewrite the story, just walking away from the chapter that no longer aligns with who you are becoming. She may have expected a dramatic exit, some storm of emotion, a push and pull of attention, but instead you gave her something rare, space that was clean, complete, and sincere. And in that space, something subtle but profound happened. The absence didn't scream, but it resonated. It wasn't a performance, yet it left an imprint, because a man who can walk away without bitterness is not running, he's rising. And that kind of absence, the one not laced with anger but born from calm resolution, doesn't vanish. It echoes, quietly, deeply, lastingly. That's what you offered her. Not punishment, not silence soaked in pain, but distance born from self-respect. And in a world that so often confuses presence with power, you reminded her of a deeper truth. Sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is step back. 5. You stopped chasing potential and embraced the truth. There was a time when you held on to what could have been, when you lived more in the future you imagined with her than the reality you were living in. You saw glimpses of what she might become, of what the two of you might be if only timing, communication, or effort had aligned. You held on to the beautiful parts, the laughter, the way she looked at you in fleeting moments of vulnerability. And for a while, those fragments were enough to justify staying, hoping, stretching yourself thin just to keep the dream alive. But eventually, you came face to face with something even more powerful than hope: the truth. You saw that while the love was real, so were the patterns, so were the misalignments, the red flags, the places where you had to dim yourself to make it work. And in that quiet reckoning, you stopped chasing potential. You stopped molding yourself to fit a version of love that required you to abandon yourself. You stepped back and saw the full picture, not just the golden memories, but the cracks in between. Not just the sweetness, but the struggle you kept excusing in the name of what if. That was when everything shifted. Because it's one thing to let go out of exhaustion, it's another to let go with clarity, with peace, with love, not just for her, but for yourself. And in that moment, you embraced one of the deepest truths the Stoics taught: amor fati, to love your fate. You didn't just accept what happened, you welcomed it, even the pain, even the silence, even the hollow space where something beautiful once lived. Because you understood that fate doesn't owe us comfort. It offers us the raw materials to become something more. And sometimes what breaks your heart also builds your foundation. So you stopped waiting for the version of her that might never come. You stopped reliving the best days as proof you should have stayed. You let it all be exactly what it was: imperfect, meaningful, over. Not because it didn't matter, but because you finally understood that you matter more. And that truth? It didn't just set you free, it set you forward. 6. You transformed pain into purpose. Pain, when it first hits, is loud. It rattles through your bones, steals your appetite, keeps you up at night wondering how something so full of promise could fall so silently apart. She let you go, and for a moment the world felt smaller, quieter, heavier. It would have been easy to stay there, lost in the echo of what was. It would have been easy to numb it, distract yourself, run toward anything that could quiet the ache, even for a moment. But that's not what you did. You chose a different path. You didn't escape the pain. You faced it. You let it sit beside you. You listened to what it had to teach, and in that space, something began to change. The pain didn't vanish, but it softened. Not because time dulled it, but because you began turning it into something useful, something sacred. Every early morning when you didn't want to get up but did anyway, became a quiet act of defiance. Every run, every rep, every deep breath through clenched teeth was a reclaiming. You weren't chasing distractions, you were building discipline. Not for anyone else to see, but because your soul needed structure when everything else had fallen apart. You picked up books not to pass the time, but to strengthen your mind. You sat with thoughts that once scared you, and instead of running, you wrote. You journaled, reflected, and asked hard questions. What am I avoiding? Who am I becoming? You didn't look for comfort in someone new. You found it slowly, piece by piece, within yourself. She may have thought her absence would break you, that you'd spiral, that you'd linger in regret. But instead you rose, quietly, steadily, not with rage, not with revenge, but with resolve. You didn't become harder. You became deeper, more anchored, more intentional. Because when a man decides to take his pain and turn it into power, there's no louder message he can send, not to the world, not to her, but to himself. You stopped asking, why did this happen to me? And started asking, what can I do with it? And that shift, that decision to build rather than break, became the turning point. You didn't heal overnight. There were setbacks, lonely evenings, quiet doubts, but you kept showing up. And over time, the pain didn't define you, it refined you. And from that fire, you didn't just survive, you transformed. 7. You built peace that didn't need to be proven. You didn't need to announce your healing to the world. You didn't post subtle hints or cryptic messages online hoping someone, maybe her, would read between the lines. There were no rebound flings to mask the emptiness, no curated smiles for social media. Because you weren't chasing validation. You were building something quieter, something real. In the stillness where others might panic, you found clarity. Solitude, once feared, became your sanctuary. You didn't rush to fill the silence with noise or the space with distraction. Instead, you leaned into the quiet. And somewhere in that space, between the unanswered questions and the unspoken pain, you began to remember who you were before the emotional chaos clouded your reflection. You stopped defining your worth by who stayed or who walked away. You no longer needed someone to choose you in order to feel chosen. You chose yourself, fully and without hesitation. And in that choice, you found a strength that doesn't demand recognition. It simply is, steady, unshaken, and quietly powerful. Peace, real peace, doesn't look like a victory lap. It looks like waking up without the weight in your chest. It looks like long walks without checking your phone. It looks like no longer needing to be seen to feel whole. It's the kind of peace that doesn't ask for attention because it's not performing, it's becoming. What you carry now isn't a mask of indifference. It's not loneliness wrapped in pride. It's liberation, the kind that comes from no longer needing to prove anything to anyone, not to her, not to the world, not even to yourself. Because once a man finds that kind of peace, the world feels different, quieter, truer. And that aura people sense around you now, it isn't mystery or distance. It's the calm of a man who no longer seeks approval. Because he finally gave himself permission to just be. 8. You gave up the urge to monitor her life. At first, it was instinctual, the pull to check, to open her page late at night, scroll through her posts, watch her stories just to see if her life was moving on without you. You weren't looking to get her back. Not really. You were looking for something familiar in a moment that felt foreign, trying to understand how someone could let go so easily while you were still sitting in the weight of it all. You told yourself it was harmless curiosity, just checking, just wondering. But deep down, you knew what it really was: emotional surveillance, a habit that did nothing but delay your own healing. Every time you peeked into her life, you handed over a little more of your peace. You created stories out of pixels, captions and glances. You questioned her new smile, the vague quotes, the faces in the background. You tried to find meaning in the meaningless, as if understanding her world from afar could bring closure to yours. But eventually, you saw the truth. It wasn't helping you move forward. It was anchoring you to the past. So you stopped. You didn't make a dramatic announcement about it. You didn't block her out of anger or unfollow her to send a message. You simply let go of the habit, of the need, of the story you were telling yourself. You realized that every time you monitored her life, you paused your own. Every time you searched for signs in hers, you abandoned your own progress. And the cost of that was far too high. By releasing the need to know, you reclaimed something greater, the role of the main character in your own life. No longer were you a passive observer in her ongoing narrative. No longer were you reacting to her updates, her choices, her silences. You returned to your center, to the present, where your real power always was. That shift didn't happen overnight. It took discipline. There were nights your thumb hovered over her profile, memories rising like old smoke, but you chose not to inhale it again. You chose clarity over chaos. You chose presence over patterns. And in that decision, you began to heal, not because you erased her, but because you stopped chasing a ghost in a digital mirror. The truth is, healing isn't just about letting someone go physically. It's about releasing the invisible strings, the habits, the thoughts, the quiet obsessions that keep you tied to someone who's no longer walking beside you. And the moment you stopped watching her life unfold, you allowed yours to take shape in a new way. You started writing your story again, page by page, without trying to compare it to hers. You focused on your growth, your goals, your grounding. You gave your energy to what was in front of you, not what was already behind. And with each day that passed, your attention returned home, to the man you were becoming. There's a rare kind of peace that comes when you no longer seek answers from someone else's life, when you no longer flinch at their updates or try to decode their happiness. That peace, it's not indifference, it's not avoidance, it's freedom. Because when you gave up the urge to monitor her life, you didn't just stop looking back, you started truly moving forward. 9. You became the man she didn't expect you to become. She thought she knew you, not just your habits and preferences, but the way you processed pain. She thought she could predict your response, that you'd reach out, plead for clarity, try to hold on to what had slipped through your hands. She assumed you'd stall, that you'd sit in sorrow, waiting for her to come back, or at least acknowledge what you shared. But instead, something else happened. You went inward, not to hide, but to rebuild. You didn't become colder. You became clearer. You didn't detach out of pride. You deepened out of purpose. What she expected was distance born from bitterness, but what you cultivated was depth born from reflection. The man she released was still learning how to carry his worth in a world that doesn't always recognize quiet strength. He was still learning how to honor his emotions without letting them consume him. He hadn't yet met the version of himself that doesn't break when he bends, that doesn't beg for validation in order to feel valuable. She walked away from that man, unaware of who he was on the verge of becoming. What she didn't anticipate was your transformation. She didn't see the stillness that followed, not as weakness, but as groundwork. She didn't know you were laying a new foundation in the silence, brick by brick, breath by breath. You weren't performing your healing for the world to applaud. You were doing the slow, often invisible work of becoming whole again. You didn't rise out of resentment. You rose out of reclamation, reclaiming your identity, your standards, your voice. And in that process, you uncovered parts of yourself that had been buried beneath compromise, confusion, and emotional noise. The man you are now moves with intention. He speaks less, but when he does, his words land with weight. His time is no longer freely given. It's offered to those who recognize its value. You didn't become this man to prove anything to her. You didn't shape this strength in the hopes that she'd come back and see what she missed. That was never the point. You became this man because something inside you demanded more, because you were finally ready, not for love, not for revenge, but for truth, for presence, for power that doesn't need to shout to be felt. And maybe one day she'll look back and realize she only knew the beginning of your story, that she left before the real turning point, that she walked away from a man on the edge of becoming. But that part? That's not yours to carry anymore, because you're no longer looking for her recognition. You've already met the only person whose approval you truly needed, the man you were always meant to be. 10. You let go, not because you stopped caring, but because you started loving yourself more. Letting go was never about turning cold. It wasn't about shutting down your heart or pretending it never mattered. You loved, you showed up, you gave deeply, fully, honestly, and that will always mean something. But there comes a moment in every man's life when he realizes love that constantly asks you to doubt yourself, to wait endlessly, to guess where you stand, isn't love worth holding on to. You didn't walk away to be seen as strong. You walked away because your soul was tired. Tired of the push and pull, tired of being available for someone who had already chosen distance. Tired of breaking yourself into pieces to keep something whole, so you chose peace over pride. You stopped waiting for closure that may never come. You stopped fighting for clarity from someone who couldn't offer it, and instead you began making space for your own healing, your own growth, and your own truth. You didn't make a grand announcement. You didn't need to. Your silence was not emptiness. It was presence. The kind of presence that only comes when a man returns to himself after losing too much of who he was trying to keep someone else. Maybe one day she'll think of you, not because you posted something for her to see, not because you tried to make her regret her decision, but because you became the kind of man who's impossible to forget. Not because of what you did after she left, but because of who you became in her absence. You didn't let go because you stopped caring. You let go because you started loving yourself more, and that choice, that's the one that changed everything. So if you're here now, reading these words and recognizing pieces of yourself in them, if your heart has been stretched by loss, but your spirit is still intact, remind yourself of this simple truth. I didn't lose her. I found myself. Let this be your reminder, your anchor, your quiet vow, to stop chasing love that leaves you confused, to stop explaining your worth to people committed to misunderstanding it, to stop being a supporting role in someone else's life, and finally step back into the lead role in your own. This is not the end. This is your becoming, not bitter, but better. There's a quiet kind of power in letting go without making a scene. For a long time, I believed that love meant staying hopeful, staying present, staying available even after the door had been closed. I thought healing would only come when I got the apology, the closure, the explanation that would somehow make the ending make sense. But that belief, it kept me stuck. It kept me orbiting someone else's life while slowly drifting away from my own. Through this journey, this story of a man who chose peace over pride, who chose discipline over desperation, I saw myself, not the polished version, the raw one, the man who wanted to be seen but realized that the only gaze he truly needed was his own. The man who stopped hoping she'd notice and instead started noticing the parts of himself that had been buried beneath guilt, confusion, and longing. And here's what I've come to understand. Healing doesn't need an audience. You don't have to prove you're okay. You just have to start showing up for yourself in small, meaningful ways. You don't need to post your progress. You need to live it. You don't need to remind her of what she lost. You need to remember what you almost forgot, you. The most powerful thing I've learned from this is that walking away isn't weakness. It's clarity. It's strength. It's the moment a man decides he's done negotiating his worth. When he's no longer chasing someone's potential but committed to his own. When he finally understands that letting go isn't about stopping the love. It's about starting a deeper one with himself. I used to think silence meant defeat. Now I know it can also mean becoming. Lesson learned: you don't heal by being chosen again. You heal by choosing yourself, fully, fiercely, unapologetically. And that's not the end of your story. That's the first chapter of who you were always meant to be. If this video resonated with you, I invite you to pause just for a moment and reflect. Ask yourself honestly, am I holding on to something that's already let go of me? More importantly, what kind of man am I becoming through this pain? Because the truth is, when you release what no longer aligns with your growth, you create space for something greater, something real, something whole. When you stop chasing what broke you, you begin building what can hold you. This journey is not about proving anything to her. It's not about winning a breakup or rewriting the past. It's about proving to yourself that you have the strength to walk away without losing your softness, the courage to feel deeply without being destroyed by it, and the wisdom to protect your peace above all. That's what true Stoicism looks like. Not emotional coldness, but emotional clarity. If something in this message spoke to you, share it in the comments. Your story might be the lifeline another man needs right now. Hit that like button if this gave you strength, and be sure to check out the recommended videos. Each one is a deeper step into reclaiming your power and living with calm, grounded purpose. Thank you for watching. Stay centered, stay unshakable.